Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. An afternoon, I'm sure, has been some very interesting and hopefully some controversial and stimulating conversations. A lot of what we've been talking about now today and yesterday is really about this pace of change that we are living through, whether it's in work, education, innovation. It's just really been dizzying, and particularly in the education sector, there feels that there's so much chaos that's happening. What leaders then really have to live through now and work through really this uncertainty and really be driven to make the right decisions. There's even more pressure now on leaders to do that. And so this conversation today just feels so timely. And so I'm happy you all can be here and be joined by Jørn Vig Knudstorp, who's the former chair and CEO of the LEGO Group, to really talk about how we can lead through this pace of change. Jørn really reimagined the LEGO Group and not only saved this company, but also reimagined this a very beloved brand. So I'm really thrilled to be joined by you today. We're going to dive into a couple topics, starting really with this topic of failure and how do leaders really continue to drive change and innovation without the perfect set of information. So Jørn, with that, I'd love to just dive in and ask this first question. You and I, we've worked together now for a couple of years. You've always said that strategy is really a hypothesis and not a guarantee, which I really love, and that failure is part of the journey. And then my question for you today is that in today's climate, where there's so much scrutiny on making the right decision, and this scrutiny can feel brutal at times, how do leaders safely fail and continue to lead? I'd love to start with that question.
Thank you. So I think the key distinction for all of us is that for many people, doing a strategy is making a plan. Strategy is not a plan. Planning is what you do once you have a strategy. So strategy is a set of choices that makes something relatively black and white. You can't do everything in the world, so you choose what you do. And also those choices should have some degree of coherence. You're all familiar with the military connotation of strategy, and let's say you want to do a flank attack. Well, maybe you first fool the enemy and you look like you're attacking them from the front, and then you're attacking them from the flank, from the side. And that's strategy choice. Once you've made that choice, you can start making a plan. How do we do this? How do we, confuse the messages and all the rest of it? And therefore, when you go to your board, and I now have the privilege of sitting both sides of the table, having made a lot of mistakes as a CEO and then made a lot of mistakes as a board chair, I'm starting to mature and learn from that. And one of the things you must do when you present your strategy to the board is to get a buy-in to the choices, not as certainty, but instead you say to them, these are great choices, and here's what needs to be true for that choice to make sense. So you're stating your assumption and thereby either directly or indirectly saying, actually strategy is a hypothesis of what might work. And that then allows you, when the strategy, which often is the case, is not delivering, to say to the board, here's what went wrong. We had the wrong assumptions, or the world developed in a different way than we assumed. And that gets you out of which is also what I said wrongly as a board chair, is like, hey, you promised me this outcome, but I didn't promise you this outcome. I said, here's an outcome I hope for if all of these things hold true. And so that's really critical, because what happens then is, and I can speak again from personal experience, as a CEO, what you do is you present something you're very certain you can deliver. So then you can say, hey, I said I would do this, and actually we've done that, and this is now the strategy. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and you're not really making any bold strategies or choices. And if your board is unwilling to accept that it is a hypothesis, well then I'm afraid to say you probably do not have the right board. Because someone who looks 5 years out in the future and say, oh, we were guaranteed this outcome from the management team, they've not understood the concept of operating a business. Business is about taking risk and seeking opportunity. And that means it's uncertain.
So specifically diving into that, there's so many things I could ask about. When you think back at your experience specifically at LEGO and this concept of failure, what are some of the things that you did not do well, and how did that shape your strategic thinking? And very specifically in context of, did you have the right board? Maybe you did not.
Yeah, I'll give you the short version because it's a very long list that's entitled My List of Risks, failures and mistakes. But I'll give you some glamorous one or big ones. I was very keen to shift the manufacturing which took place we had sought out the most expensive places to manufacture. So that includes Switzerland, South Korea, Denmark, Connecticut here in the US. And wanted to move that to another place. And there were excellent companies around, such as Flextronics, who produce plastics for Microsoft, Xbox, and for Hewlett-Packard, and like a long list. And they do it for many, many, many customers. And they looked at this and said, "Oh, this is like super easy. We can do that for you." And I decided that manufacturing was no longer part of the core of what the Lego Group was about. So we did that, and it was a big failure and big mistake. Well documented, and it's written about various places, so I don't say something super secret. But and what we learned from it was not the act of molding one Lego brick. It's the act of molding about 100 billion Lego bricks in about 12,000 different color and shape variations, and sell half of those bricks in about 300 million sets that assist on average of 300 different of those common elements, and be able to deliver them in 8 weeks up to Christmas. That's something that should have made Stalin quite stressed in a communist economy, but apparently not the Lego Group, because we think we can do that without the price mechanism. We are not believers in the invisible hand of the market. We are the visible hand of the market. And so, of course, Flextronics were completely overwhelmed with that task. So what we learned from that was we needed a different operating model, and we hired 200 master planners who built an elaborate enterprise architecture system that were able to optimize logistics, production cost, and that whole setup. So something good came out of that experience. But 3 years after the company went bankrupt, I nearly killed it once again going through that exercise. So that'd be one example. On the other side, on the product side, I learned very valuable lessons because the founder, a very entrepreneurial family member that I replaced as a CEO, was all about endless creativity. And you'll all be like, yeah, that's how I was as a child as well. I was one of those who had endless creativity with Lego bricks. Well, I have an update for you. It turns out that 80 to 90% of those who build Lego love to build other people's creations. So building sets according to instructions. And so it took me a while to make quite a few failures to figure that out, and then getting that right. And it turned out that we were not very good at making those instructions. And so we studied flow theory and growth mindset and everything. How do you balance capability with challenge and get that right? So when you see the age marking on the Lego set, it's not actually how old you are. It's how long you played the piano, so to speak, how advanced you are in playing other people's music, or in this case, building other people's creations. Turns out it's super satisfying. I'm still struggling to understand this fact, but it's the case, and it's what today makes the company insanely successful. So I just have to go, I don't understand it, but I take it as a beautiful fact, and we run by that.
I really did not see that we were going to bring Stalin and the Communist Party into the conversation, so that was not on my bingo card, but thank you. So when you talk about endless creativity, how does that coexist in this environment now of performance? Extreme performance-obsessed culture, scrutiny, but yet balancing that with creativity, and you talk about it as playfulness.
Yeah, so obviously, but so I think playfulness, first we need to discuss very quickly, what is play? Toys are just tools that are fun to use. So a hammer can be a toy, a computer can be a toy. It becomes a toy instead of a tool the moment that it's fun to use, condition number one. Number two is that you go for a goal, there's something you want to solve, there's something you want to accomplish through the play. Number three is that you are intrinsically motivated, and therefore learning happens in a normal way. I'm told that the brain has about 20 megabytes of random access memory. This is something for those of us who bought computers when they were first introduced in homes. We know 20, that's like not a lot, but that's what we had, and that's like 5 photos on your iPhone. That's what the brain can remember. That's why when you leave the room in half an hour, you might remember my name, and tomorrow you might remember less than my name from this talk, because
maybe
you have
we
these
talked
20
about Stalin,
megabytes.
you'll remember that.
Yes. So, here's the thing. When we play, we are programming ourselves to something without thinking about it. It's implicit learning, and we are hugely motivated. We're very bad at explicit learning. When we're going to a classroom and somebody says, you need to learn algebra, the brain goes, oh shit, this is going to be horrible. But if it's like, oh, I must learn this so I can win this game or play this activity, I'm having fun. Also, when you're playful, you're working with the subconscious mind. That's why you can play with an idea, you can play with a concept. By the way, you feel free to take risk because it's just play, it's not for real. So even you can drive change in organization by playing it in, because as you play it in, you repeat patterns, and those patterns become habit, and those habits becomes your attitude, and that attitude becomes your character, and then ultimately becomes your culture. So that's actually how you go about creating that change. So playfulness to me is not an alternative to leadership. It's not something you can occasionally do. It's how you do leadership, because it gives you that special connection. Have you ever seen a sports game, or even yourself played a sports game, where you said, oh my God, I did something I had not planned here, which in a beautiful moment was even maybe like a genius action. That's playfulness, that's the subconscious programming, and you're not even thinking anymore, you're just doing it. And that's how you should be as a leader. You should be doing beautiful things without planning them and being deliberate, but you have practiced them in the playful practices that you do before. So I think it's essential and unavoidable.
So how do you do that practically? And I would say the audience, we probably have a range of leaders from nonprofit, K-12, university, startups, founders, investors, and large companies. And so how do you practically implement that at all these different stages and asset classes?
Yeah, so first of all, if you're playful, you're more happy with risk. So you gotta, if you are the lucky position that you can set the mood in the room, you're responsible for creating a wonderful atmosphere where you allow playfulness. And one of the things that makes play more fun is that we're different. So you can even put on different hats, so you can give people different roles and say, hey, you know, how would Steve Jobs think about this problem? How would Donald Trump think about this problem? How would so-and-so think about that problem? And then say to people, I know that you're not Donald Trump, but do you mind role-playing him for a second? And everybody starts laughing. You know, so now suddenly it's a fun meeting. And that creates and releases a different kind of energy. So that would be one of the things. Another thing that's been key for me, and that came from my grandfather, he said to me, Jørgen really only does what he really feels like. And I've tried to, you know, you can't always do that, but seek out things that you feel like doing with people you love being together with. That gives you a better environment.
So that also speaks a lot to experimentation. And so thinking back again to Lego, where you had said that you pulled the company out of bankruptcy, you almost bankrupted it again. How do you make room for experimentation without losing momentum and even losing your job and being removed as CEO while you're in the middle of transformation?
Yeah, it's good to have a family owner who's patient. But no, I think on a serious note to that, I mean, I think first of all, people talk a lot about sort of uncertainty and change and so on. There's a very good quote by somebody, I forgot the name, but it's sort of like, first focus on what has not changed. You know, if you feel overwhelmed with change, just start thinking about what has not changed. There's a lot of things that are not changing while a lot of things are changing. So there's like some calm. Then try to distinguish what is urgent and what is important. Then you'll probably discover, like we talk about AI at this wonderful ASU GSV summit, but you know, technology doesn't come overnight. Technology comes in waves of about 20 years. I mean, I take the long view here, but still, you know, we had mainframe computers, then we got PC client, then we got mobile, and now about 20 years after mobile, we're getting AI. So it's not like super surprising if you take that picture and you look for the big waves and you want to surf those waves, so you keep an eye on that. The next thing you do, which I think is really critical when people get overwhelmed and I get overwhelmed, is you ask yourself a question that I'm told, I haven't read the book, comes back to Aristoteles. So Aristoteles, I think many of you will know, is very famous for his book of logic. You know, there's like a mathematical explanation or logical explanation of things. He apparently wrote another book, which is about reasoning. And he should have said something like, In the first book about logic, it's about the world that could not be anything else than it is. The apple falls from the tree, although I think later Newton discovered up in space it doesn't, but but the world where things can only be what they are. The other world is the world where things might be. And that's the other book. That's the reasoning argument. That's the world of complexity. The world of complicatedness is the one I talked about with Flextronics and supply chains and logistics. It's very, very complicated, but it is a well-defined problem, and there are well-defined, complicated solutions to sorting those problems. Uncertainty is not unknown, uncertainty is definable. In complex problems where the world might end up in a particular place but could end up in another place, which is the domain of strategy, is complex because you don't know what you don't know, and there are many unknowns, and it's impossible to predict the future. If you're sitting now and thinking, what is he talking about? I can say over dinner last night, somebody asked me, you're a PhD in economics, right? I'm buying a house in LA. Do you think interest rates will go up and down? And before I answered, the CFO from another company sitting next to me said, there's no way of knowing that. It's completely unpredictable. Poor guy. But it's true. So that's the world of complex. And so what do you do when you operate in the world of complex as opposed to complicated is you do actually, now we're talking about what it means to be a leader, you do actually have an obligation to simplify. How do you simplify? You choose a metric that defines the strategy or the transformation you're going through. So let me give you a wonderful example from a person I admire very much. This is all in the public domain. If you are interested, you can listen to investor calls from Starbucks over the last couple of quarters. I have a brilliant, relatively new CEO, Brian Nichols. Imagine running a business of 45,000 stores in 87 countries with about 500,000 employees. And there's a ton of transformation programs, menu, digital, AI, unions, and it's a complex agenda. What is his answer to that? 4 minutes. Serve a premium cup of quality coffee in less than 4 minutes in stores with a human touch and a seat. And everything the company does optimizes to that equation. Should we install new brewing equipment? Should we have digital menu boards? Is the menu too big or too small? Where should we locate the drive-thru? How do we handle mobile ordering? Does it deliver on 4 minutes or not? And I actually think of that example a lot when I'm at this summit, because I'm wondering, some of those companies that are trying to change the outcomes in education, what is that single metric they're optimizing to? Is it, for instance, the teacher finds his or her job super easy to do despite learner variability in the classroom? That would be one example of that. So you can see that it's not ignoring the complexity, but it's also finding a way forward in the complexity, and then you mobilize and create energy around that. And then I think the final step, which is for me what I took most away from my time at Lego, is sort of how do you create resilience? Because, shit's going to happen. You need to, things will not go as you hope for. So how do you have resilience from that? And I'm not like, the master class on resilience, but I have some personal experiences. The first one is, I always say to our teams, we are 80% responsible for what happens. And when things are going well, people are like, yeah, great, give us a bonus. But I still left 20% to things that you're not responsible for, but you're of course 100% accountable. But that means also when things go wrong, you can say it was because of Donald Trump or the US dollar or tariffs or whatever, but if you've just acknowledged that you're 80% responsible, then no matter what other people outside the company do, it's your problem. You need to solve it. That's a good starting point for resilience. Another one that comes to my mind is when we think about crisis. So often when there's a crisis, people say, oh, there's no way we could have known the financial crisis would come in 2008. There's no way we could have known the war in Ukraine would start in 22. Well, I think, this is a longer discussion, but I feel when you reflect on that, you could actually have predicted those things started. So I generally say a crisis starts much earlier than it appears to. So you never have a sudden crisis. The crisis started years earlier, and if you had been watching those signals, you would have watch that. Then people say, oh, how might I watch that in a business? And I think how you might watch that in a business is you use what I would call stakeholder targets. So instead of just looking at your revenues or your EBIT, check in with the customer. Check in with the students if it's an education business. Check the NPS, the satisfaction score, employees' engagement. And I'll just reveal this to you if you don't know. They are never perfect, never. And they are signals to you that something is not great, even if you have the best revenue growth that you've ever seen. So the last advice from me is listen to the complainers. I find too often when somebody complains, they're being dismissed as a small minority or, we don't listen to them. They're always complaining and bitching and so on. No, they're not. Most people are not listening enough to those who complain. And if I may say so on a smile on my face, it's meant as a humorous remark, is there's a lot of hotel managers that I would hope would come and sleep with me in my room, because I'm traveling a lot, and I come into hotel rooms constantly, and I can't find the power plugs. I can't get the basic needs solved when I'm a business traveler, and I'm just thinking, what the hell? They're building these hotels. Why are they not just checking in with me whether the room is optimized? Like, it would take half an hour and then the rest of my travel life would be wonderful. And what do you think happens when I complain about that? It goes into another box of, oh, complainers. So that's the key. So if you watch out for those things, I think you can build a more resilient business.
So a couple questions from that. One is, was there a single metric that you solved for when you were turning around Lego, similar to the 4 minutes?
Yes, there was, and it was the wrong one, in the sense that it was a financial one. The reason for that is that many people ask, how could you, 3 years out of doing a PhD in something very esoteric, become the CEO of such a wonderful company? I did that because one day somebody at the family-owned business said to me, we're trying to figure out how many dividends we might pay out in the future. And I said, oh, that's an interesting problem. And they also said, why do we actually measure cash flow? And I was thinking, I should know the answer, but this is such a fundamental question, I've forgotten the answer. So I went back to Timothy Kohler's book on valuation, and then I found a great formula that calculated what some people call economic profit or value creation. It's whether you generate a higher return than the risk-adjusted requirement of return. And the analysis I created showed that for the past 13 years of this company existence, it had not for a single day delivered any value to its owners. It had profits, but not value. And during this time, it had 4 times been nominated the most admired company by business journalists in my native home of tiny little bit Denmark. So I thought, wow, this is great. Isn't that funny? That actually, and I just made a little bottom line to the owner. I said, you know what? If you had put your money in risk-free government bonds, you would have been €1 million wealthier for every single day for the past 13 years. I thought that was kind of interesting. The first reaction from the management team was, well, that's not fair because we've never looked at those numbers before. And I was a very naive young man. I said, actually, that doesn't matter because this is the truth and you've just not looked at the truth. Then the chairman of the board said, Jørgen, I think you should leave now. Then I went outside the building and I called my wife and I said, I'm coming home to academia now. This was fun. So actually after that, there was a little bit of tumult and I started running the company and then everybody got that target. So it was a financial target and it did some good things for a while. But I wish it had been 4 minutes because I think what's great with what Brian is doing at Starbucks is it's the customer experience. So that's what I would advise you to take away is simplify the complexity, give them a customer experience target. Always, always, always focus on your product and your customer experience. And then second order, employee experience. If you do well by the customer, if you do well in product and the employee experience, you cannot help yourself from making money. But do not start with what money do we need to make. Money making is a lagging indicator of doing the right things to solve other people's problems. So that's why I didn't have the right one.
So in that situation, how did you rebuild trust with your board, with your leadership after they asked you to politely leave the room and you went home early?
Yeah, it's a funny experience because the first couple of years, I was very lucky to hire a super experienced CFO, probably saved my life. He always said, you know, you fooled me, you didn't tell me how terrible it was. He often would come into my office and say, I have not seen so much shit in my life. He came from the country's largest bank, and he said, it's funny because in this bank, every month we made as much money as this company is losing annually, and everybody's just pissed off. They're so angry in the bank. And in this company, we're losing the same amount of money that the other bank is making, and everybody's happy. But he was very, very helpful, and he said to me, you really don't have a strategy. We can make an action plan so we can start building trust. So we actually said to the organization, we have no idea what our mission is, we have no idea what the strategy is, we're just trying to survive, generate cash so we don't go bankrupt again, and here's the action plan to do that, and you can measure us by that we do what's in that action plan. So very tangible, and that started building some trust. So after a couple of years, we were relatively successful with that. And then, of course, I realized, okay, now we need a strategy. Now we actually need to have a vision for the future and what we're all about. And actually, quite a lot of people came to me and said, oh, I missed the last couple of years. I said, why is that? They were black and white. And so, of course, tried to do some of that. We introduced stakeholder targets that are completely unchanged. We introduced them in 2007, and now in 25, they're the same. And that means only 20% of reward is related to the profitability of a company. The next 20% is how children would recommend it, so Net Promoter Score, and then retailers, customer satisfaction score, employees, creative engagement, and then the reputation of the company as a trustworthy company. And it's just for the third time in a row been nominated the world's most trusted company.
So your role has shifted now from operator CEO to board member. And you're on the board of a number of different companies. Starbucks, you've talked about, BrainPop, several others. And so if you think about how the relationship between the board and the operating team can either go really well or really wrong, what are some of those things that you would do differently now? What's been the hardest moment, you would say, reflecting back on your experience?
Yeah, so I have some very clear lessons there. I think the problem for a active executive who comes onto a board and have not understood that they are no longer an active executive is that they continue operating. Mm-hmm. And it's quite painful for everybody. The lesson is you are no longer running anything. Mm-hmm. You are supervising. If we were to use an analogy, it's like the CEO or the executive team is the band on stage and you're watching the show. Maybe from the first row, or maybe they're in the studio and you're behind the mixing pult. You're the one who can say, hey, I think you're a little bit out of tune now. Should we do another take of this song? But you are not performing, and you are not in the limelight. You are not famous. You are not attracting attention anymore. You are here to make other people successful. So the lesson I learned was that, I thought to add value as a board member, my job was to, those things in old newspapers, like find 5 mistakes in this picture. That was like how I came to a board meeting. Let me find what they're doing wrong and then make a really good point. And because I'm an experienced guy and I'm a PhD, I can be really nasty at that. And that's terrible. It creates the whole wrong ambience. And by the way, you probably know this, as executives come to a board meeting, what are they concluded with that kind of board? What are they here to do? Get to yes, and then get the hell out of here. We don't want to have a discussion with the board because they are terrible and they think they know how to run this. So how do you change that dynamic? You come to the board meeting as if you're the chair or a board member and you say, so first of all, I'm here to make you successful. My main thing is, how can I make you successful? Number 2, I think to be successful in this role is like being a finely tuned piano. And I don't know always if I'm in tune. I do my best, I come to the meeting to do everything to make you successful, but could you please tell me if I'm out of tune? Because I really want to know. And you can say that to every single of your board colleagues or committee members. You can say it to the executives. And what you will learn is that if you're a board member, especially if you're the board chair, very few people will want to tell you you're out of tune. Like, you have to be like massively out of tune, and when you're massively out of tune, they kind of go, oh, this is so bad, I'm not going to be the one who tells him that. So in a recent board meeting, I went overboard to sort of like just really make that point, and then I went to the bathroom. A fellow board member was also coming to the bathroom, and here in America, they're not all that separated. And we are doing what you do in a bathroom, and then he said to me, thank you for asking for the feedback. I have something for you. I was like, oh, this is kind of strange time to do that, but I'm ready. And then he said, in the meetings, you always sit in a seat where you turn your back on me. I was like, is that really all? I was almost saying, stop. But then I said, oh, thank you. Thank you for telling me that. That really means a lot that you decided to tell me that. Thanks. I'll never let it happen again. Yeah, it sounds strange, but I think you can become quite good at that. I think there's another skill in board meetings, if I may go into that. Management teams try to get aligned. Boards don't have to get fully aligned. Actually, if a board is going to be productive, it should have a diversity of perspectives. And we're all super experienced, and I'm on the board at this and that, so you must think we're all very good at handling diverse perspectives and disagreement. No. There is massive groupthink. I have literally examples of board members coming to me before a board meeting in some of the boards and saying, oh, did you read that paper? Oh my God, I read that paper. We have no role here. What's going on? And then we're in the board meeting, in the discussion. These are very experienced executives. And then I'm sort of saying, hey, but what about this paper? And then the same person says, yeah, it was very well written. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. So it's very difficult to be honest. Very difficult. And I'm a little bit lucky because, as my youngest daughter would say, my dad is not very good at confrontation and conflicts. I was not created that way. And I think when you have a confrontation, I worry that you're either harassing somebody or you're being harassed, which of course I understand is a wrong distinction. But so we need to find the middle ground. So I work with some very strong personalities on boards and executive teams, so I've really failed a lot here. One day I called one such person, and I said, I really admire you. I almost sort of love you. You're a genius at what you do. But I have to tell you that if you keep doing this and that thing we were discussing, my hand is on the boilerplate towards all the other investors. And if shit hits the fan, it's going to fly straight in my face. And if I need to be an asshole to you, I'm going to be an asshole. And by the way, I think you'll thank me a year from now for not remaining silent. And that sort of then became my trick. So I say to other board members, I'm not in favor of saying no, but I'm going to say no because I think that's how I serve you best. I know it's manipulation almost, but at least, I'm being specific, concrete, direct, instead of beating around the bush. And that actually really works. And then as a chair, you can always say, I don't believe that we think similarly about this topic. There's gotta be a different, can't we just play that there's a different opinion? Why don't you say a different opinion? And then suddenly the debate catches on and you do get different opinions to be tabled, but I find you have to push quite hard for disagreement instead of getting it. And then occasionally you have somebody, like I was lucky when I was a young and naive and inexperienced CEO, I had a board member who said, well, what you're proposing there is just really stupid. It's like really stupid. Turns out he didn't have strong relational skills, but he actually loved working with me. I figured that out a little bit later, so he was fantastic. But relationships were maybe not his forte.
So what would the advice be to a young CEO in managing the board? Those are great examples, I think, of interboard dynamics, and what do you do as a chair with your other board members?
Yeah.
What if you are a young CEO?
Yeah, so I think as a young CEO that, or any CEO actually, is that the survival fight and flight mechanism is let's get to yes and then go home. But what you do instead is two things. First of all, you say, I'm so excited I have a board. I can't wait to hear your perspectives. And hey guys, I really hope you see it differently than us in the management team. We spent so much time getting to this. I don't just want this to be a walkover. And then the board feels like, okay, great, there's an invitation. But then occasionally you also have board members like me or other board members who don't understand their role. So they're saying, hey, this initiative you want to do in March, can't you get it done by January? And then you go, oh my God, now the board is asking for that. But then the trick for the young CEO is to say, hey, great push, I acknowledge it and I'd be happy to look at that. I want to check something with you. If it doesn't work, am I accountable for that? Because I thought maybe the board would not take accountability for that. I consider it an input. And then 9 out of 10 times the board is going to say, yeah, it was just an input. Of course, if the board says, no, it's a demand, we take accountability for that, you can say, oh, I'm happy to try it, and then, of course, we share the burden if it doesn't work out. But boards are only accountable for the choice of CEO, approving the annual accounts, selecting other board members, the overall governance. You know, the boards are only accountable for very, 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 very few things. And therefore, the executive also have to be good at handling conflict, even if it's a young CEO, and say, I hear you, I feel super accountable for this thing succeeding. I want to take your input in, but is it okay I decide eventually how I use your thoughts? Very difficult for a board to not agree to that, and very mature of that person to handle it that way.
Yeah. So we only have a few minutes left, and I wanted to go back to one of the first things that we talked about, is just leading through this time of uncertainty. I think particularly for leaders, there's so much economic uncertainty, tech disruption, culture clashes, so much change happening. One of the things that I see as an executive recruiter is that CEOs are really getting burnt out. CEOs, university presidents, they're not staying in their roles as long as they had been in the past. And so how do you, either you as a board member, but really it's more, how do the best leaders avoid burning out in this current climate, or even just sliding into mediocrity?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and here I'm also an example of doing it all wrong. I got this responsibility. I was 34 years old. I had once been in a great shape, but now I was also a father of a couple of children, and So I thought, okay, this is like an amazing opportunity. I may not be here in 2 years, so I'm going to go all in. But unfortunately, all in didn't last it for 15 years. And somewhere down the road, I did a medical checkup, and I was maybe almost 40 years old. And the doctor said to me, you have the health of a 65-year-old. And my weight was significantly above what it is today. So I was not a good example. And so I've spent some time with people who've taught me about breathing and physical exercise and mentality and so on. And I don't think there's one model, but I'm happy to share very briefly what I believe in. I believe in there's an equation in life, and in terms of the supply side of the equation is sleep, exercise, diet. It's just super important. It's also your competency, of course. Are you what you're working on? Do you have competencies? Do you need some other people to help you? And then it's actually your relationships. If you are in good relationships in your team, with your colleagues, with your board, I mean, it just makes you much more capable. So that's your supply side. And then that is the size of challenge you can take on depending on how well you do that. And the size of challenge is an equation of your know-how, tacit or explicit know-how. It is your experience. Have you seen it before? Before I walked in here, somebody said, are you nervous? And I said, I'm not super nervous. I've done this rodeo before, but I have prepared quite a bit because it's not like you just walk up here and talk. And then there's something I call strength. And strength is this resilience. It's the dealing with setbacks. It's bouncing back from adversity. It's dealing, you have entertained the inconceivable, and then the inconceivable happens and you're kind of prepared. So that's something I live by. I love to wake up in the morning and go through messages, get it all archived, write a little bit in my logbook, which is for me like a reading, writing, reflecting tool. And then define what are the key tasks of the day, and I do some breathing. And so it sort of just helps me set, okay, I'm here and this is what's happening. And that works for me, it may not work for others. And then also in your what you take on in your job, be very clear what only you can do. And especially for a CEO, that's important because you might be good at what you used to do and you're going to do somebody else's job. Forget about that. Only do what only you can do.
Thank you. I think we'll end on that note, and I just want to say thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary.
Really, the takeaways of being bold and not being afraid to experiment, but that topic of resilience and trust, I think, are just such important wrappers around that certainly we talk about in education and workforce, just in life. And so, thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Very much,
It's my pleasure
everyone.
to share.